All right, so perhaps you've watched part one of this series, which was disassembling the ERS 210 head block and removing the pitch pan and tilt access servos. Part two was cleaning and or replacing clutches, and so part three is reassembly. So I'm going to go ahead and start with pitch access because many of you think the common repair that you'll want to do. So as a reminder, we reinserted the servo back into the base of the motor block, soldered the flexible connector, and now we're just going to reverse the process we did to disassemble. So that edge of the motor block goes through the neck assembly. It's keyed, so it can only go one way. Don't forget we had that washer that goes on next. And then remember there was a pressure clip here. It should just snap back into place. There's a little round pin to guide us. There we go. Doesn't hurt to move the servo just to make sure there's nothing mechanically binding. And just because I'm not exactly liking that, I'm going to go ahead and apply a little power to the servo and just make sure. There we go. This one does have a lot of mechanical tension on it, and it's by design because the head of the dog is heavy, and we need to make sure that it doesn't errantly move. My high-tech test rig is somewhat unreliable today. There we go. Okay. That's the motor block. Now motor block goes into the base. Again, reversing what we did before. So there was this metal clip. Holes go on the bottom. And then what I like to do when we're putting the motor block assembly back together here is I like to kind of bias it towards the front. Lift the cable looms out of your way. But those front clips are the ones that are finicky. I don't want to break those guys, so I want to make sure that they snapped in, and you heard that good there. And then these other rear ones, just like when we disassembled, I'm listening for the click. Now, actually both sides. Okay, there we go. Both sides are clicked in. And then when we're done, we'll reassemble. We'll put those 4 screws back in. Flexible connector goes out back in the way it came. Now, here's an interesting thing. You see the wire looms in the way. Guess what? We're not going to put it together that way because that wire loom rides on top. And if you were being patient, you could tape all of this out of your way. I'm going to be impatient and just do my best to hold it out of the way. Flexi goes under the plastic. Remember, we left this board out for a reason so that we could reassemble it a little bit more easily. In this case, I think I'm just going to go ahead and use a flat tweezer. Grab that connector right down at the end. Hold the board, get him lined up, and then just wiggle him in, make sure he's all the way in. Basically, you shouldn't see any exposed metal on that connector. Now we can snap that interface board back into place. All right, and cable routing is important. So that flexi comes, the L goes down, it sits in the track, comes across, it folds 2 times so that it lays flat, and then that plastic, if the adhesive is still good, that's great. Go ahead and use it. If not, go ahead and tape it down with some electrical tape or something. Be careful not to cover these holes, but we want it to be in place like this. There's a sort of a shoulder to it that covers up the flexi, and when this wire loom comes out, we want it to loop up and in this way so that U sits like this. And the reason for that is there's a little bit of space in the back of the top housing where that wire loom can move. If you put it together wrong, it'll probably still work, but you'll end up hearing clicking noises as like this piece of plastic catches here. Now here's the part that I often forget, and it's super annoying if you do. Put the plastic back on. You can just loose fit it. If you forget to do this and you put the dog's head back on, it's not really a lot of fun. In my case, I'm just going to go ahead and snap that back. Now remember, when we took it off, we had to clear that little plastic light tunnel. Same thing when we put it back together. It's a good snap, all fits together well, and I'll spare you, but I would put the 4 screws back in for the motor block and the 4 screws that go in on an angle back in here. Actually, I'll do one of each for you now, just so we can say we did it. Little trick that I learned from, I think it was Steve's Guides online. So when you are doing these screws that are going into plastic, go counterclockwise, gently, not with any pressure, until you feel or hear a little click. And that's the start of where that thread, because these were self-tapping screws, was before. And then these screws should go back in very gently, like, you know, a hot knife through butter, as they say. By the way, of the 2 sets of screws, 4 and 4, the longer ones hold the plastic on, the shorter ones are for the motor block, so that was one of the shorter. Here's one of the longer, and I'm going to do that same trick. It's a little harder on this plastic because of the angle. But I set it in there gently. I'm not applying any pressure. I'm just feeling click. There was the click. And then I'm not feeling any resistance going back in. So what's the downside? If you don't do it that way and you cut a second set of threads, you can only do that a couple of times before you're not going to be able to use those screws again. So we'll set that guy aside. Go back to the head reassembly. Just check as you're doing this that that clip that's holding the base together didn't get pushed back down, and then you pull up on it and end up tearing that thing. I like to reverse this, put the tilt axis back in. That flexi has to go under the board, so I just lift up on the board a little bit. Slide that guy in. There, it went right under for me. And then when you reassemble, all of these connectors that go to the tilt and the pan servo have 3 holes. One is threaded, or one is for the screw. The other 2 are for some little indents that protrude out of what it's connecting to, and that's so that as it swivels and moves, it's not loose. So basically what I'm doing here is trying to line up a couple of items. One, that servo's got notches that it goes into in this assembly, and then those little holes, those little bumps that have to line up into the nylon. So it's a little bit of an art form and a little bit of a Jenga puzzle. And there we go. I'm visually checking, even though you maybe can't see it, that the nylon is sitting up against the PVC. Got that screw that came out of that shaft again, counterclockwise, click, I felt it. Goes in nice and smooth. And now, while we're on this side, you can see that, well, you can't, I can, that flexi is sitting underneath the board, and this is another one of these really tricky ones. I lift up the board as much as I can. Now, this board can come out, but at the expense of disconnecting the jaw servo flexi, which if you disconnect that, it's a nightmare to try to reconnect. So I will do everything in my power to not have that happen. So let's see if I can do that. So I've got my flat tweezer. I've got it right under the plastic reinforcement for that connector. And it looks like it's gonna go, it's on a little bit of an angle, so I don't want to force it. Wiggle. There. And that's all the way, it inserted all the way in. You can't really see, but I can tell that there's no contact showing, so I got that all the way. Okay, so what would I like to do next? I think what I'd like to do is reseat the camera assembly, just because. So this flexible cable is bent funny because it actually sits in the little space between the board and the servo. Make sure you put him there and not in front, because you put him in front, he's going to bind on the servo. And again, now we want to make sure that this head assembly is loose enough that I can do this, but I'm going to gently pry top and bottom apart, and I'm just going to kind of work that camera assembly back in place. The base of the camera assembly has a slotted edge, and it's going to try to slide onto the bottom of this base. So in the absence of a great camera angle, you'll just have to trust me, and it's a little bit of finesse. that's on there solid. And we go back to we took 4 screws from underneath the jaw and 1 from the camera assembly. Always check that clip because he wants to go back in place. This is where a magnetized screwdriver helps, which is what I have, counterclockwise till you feel it click, and then clockwise. So he's reassembled. I'm not going to go ahead and put the other 4 screws in at the moment, just because I like to be able to sort of move the assembly and the board around as needed to try to get this last servo in. And the servo itself is easy. It's the flexi, because from the factory, the flexi sits in like this, wraps under and goes on the front edge of the board, and then we've got this adhesive. Now, feeling this, I think I can reuse that adhesive. So I also have some cloth tape that I use if the adhesive isn't still tacky, but in this case I'm going to do my best to reuse it. So this time, sometimes I use this tweezer. I'm going to try the hemostat. Why? Because I like to say hemostat. No, not really. It allows me a particular angle, which you can't see because my wrist is in the way. So lift up on the board, lock that guy down in there. Okay, he's mostly in, just a little bit not in, but because he's mostly in, I should be able to switch to the flat tweezer. Nope. Popped him right out, I did. Well, let's go back to plan A. That's why we say don't try this at home. Okay, that worked out really well that time. Honestly, folks, sometimes I never know which tool is going to be the best. What I'm doing now is just trying to get that adhesive to sit back. Throw that plexi over the top so that I have the right angle on it. If you don't have this tape in place, you can end up with clicking when the dog turns his head, which is less than stellar. So I'm not liking that very much. So I'm going to go ahead and apply a little bit more cloth tape. And we're back. Okay. Took me a little bit, but I was able to get that tape in the correct position. So now that servo can slide back into his home spot. There's that clip, so we have to, should slide across it, but sometimes it just needs just a gentle lift up. That tool's a little big. Toothpicks are great. And not quite. Perfecto. And now we just reverse the process. So there's 2 little nubs that come up out of that bottom mount where this servo's top bit will sit. There's this clip in the back. Got our 4 screws. Which I almost lost track of, but didn't. Okay, so all of our flexis are back together. life is good. Have to reseat the logic board here for the head. And because of when we rerouted that camera cable, it's going to need a good nudge forward. There's two little clips at the front that it sits in, and make sure the board's in those clips. And then there's these two clips that we took off in the first place. Should be gentle. Always check to make sure that the ear wire looms aren't stuck in that little slot. You don't want to pinch them under the board. If this guy doesn't want to go in, 9 times out of 9, it's because the board's not far enough forward. You'll see there's a plastic alignment tab here that if you're out of alignment, it's not going to work. So, okay, what next? I think we can put back the cranial ridge. So this is where you'll notice I routed the wire loom to get it out of my way for his other ear. I'm going to put that back where it belongs, which is right across top that flexi. Remember, there's a hole in the back, slides in thusly, and then under some clips, there's that screw we talked about. Now, one of the things that I sometimes do is I'll reinsert this flexi first, but for our purposes, I won't. Okay, slide in. Don't forget to tighten this guy. It won't be the end of the world, trust me, but it's helpful. And again, my little friends, the 90-degree flat jaw, or smooth jaw, I should say. Hook that connector in. Good. Left ear can go back on. These are kind of funny, especially on this side of the head because of that flexi bends down right where it wants to be. You almost have to kind of put them in on a little bit of an angle. There's two tabs they sit on, and then it falls under. So it's, trust me, if you ever do this, you'll see. Put the ear rotator screw back in. All right, and now just because it's convenient, I'm going to go ahead and put those 4 screws for the bottom of the jaw back in, because once I put the dog's head back on his neck, it's going to become terribly inconvenient to do so. I'm back to using the double zero because it's a little bit easier. I mean, I'm not going to lie to you here. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to still do that counterclockwise trick, but then we're going in on a slight angle. And ideally, you wouldn't do this, but the risk of doing this over the full disassembly of the dog's head and jaw to do this repair, in my opinion, is warranted. So a lot more damage to be done taking that jaw off. All right, and likewise, time has come to put the remaining screws back into the base. Why? Just because once the dog's assembled, I don't really want to be flipping them upside down and sideways to do this. Okay, so reassembly. Another one of these steps to try to get right. First of all, make sure that that plastic is on before you do this part. And now we have to get this fat wire loom cloth through that same small hole. I've left that cowling screw out still. So what we're going to do, as everybody says, and what I'm doing is I'm kind of tugging at that cowling from the inside while I feed the loom in from this outside. And it's always going to be a tight fit. If you're tearing the cloth up, you probably want to start over. And then basically these connectors like to get hung up. And I try not to perturb them too much, as I mentioned. I like them to stay in as natural position as possible. So there, we reassemble. Okay, so next part's easy, right? You just put this together, plug everything in. No, because we need to put that other cowling screw back in. Because if we forget to do that, life is no bueno. Not that the dog can't operate without it, but here at aiboclinic, You always want to send them home with all of their parts. Okay, now, and by the way, you can only do that when the two bits are separated. I shouldn't say that. If you've got a very steady hand, a great eye, and a magnetic screwdriver, you can otherwise do it. So wire loom goes to the outside, pup's head goes back on, pull up that slack, and then I'll try to do this so I can show you. Ideally, if you're in this position, the nylon is there. If not, you can sort of just mostly get it in position, pivot the head, but then you want to make sure that you're absolutely lined up correctly. So the two indents are up in the outermost holes. The threaded hole is available for screw that holds the head to the neck. And those I always like to walk backwards until I feel that pop, because I want to make sure you get them right. Your rotator goes back up. Make sure you're not caught on the wires. Remember, a little bit of an angle. There we go. Should pop in naturally. Don't forget that ear rotator screw. Now is probably a good time to reconnect I always kind of field test the servos too, just make sure they're good. Good time to reconnect the loom. Remember what we said. We like them to sit down, so see, that's twisting it up. It's twisting it down. That cable wad or the cloth wire loom tape can sit down a little lower. When I reassemble the dog, I like them to be up here a little bit free, but it's convenient for reassembly just to wedge it in there a tiny bit. Right angle smooth, and then as close as I can to the connector. And you really, if your fingers are small and you've got good eyesight, you can do this freehand. I have neither of those two advantages. Okay, there's one. There's two. You get confused, the colored dots go to the outer edge of the connector. Okay. Well, that looks good. Wires are out of the way. Kind of quick check, make sure that we reconnected that head sensor button flexi. We did. A little bit of tape coming off here for the ear looms. Go ahead and put a little extra on there to hold that back in place. That just helps so that we don't hear wires rattling around. Okay, now getting into the home stretch. Remember, we took the board off. Don't want to touch those bits. These flexi insertions are challenging, right? That edge, those are very fine contacts, and that reinforcement plastic, sometimes the adhesive that holds it on is gone the way of the dodo. Best thing to do is to try to maybe work it in with your finger first, and if not, go ahead and get those right angles. But this one, you just have to be careful. No more of these flexis on the planet, folks. So I feel like that one needs a little bit of help. So I am going to grab it with the right angle connector, or right angle smooth jaw. I'm going to grab it right at the edge of the tape of the blue reinforcing plastic, and I'm just going to try to rock him in there. Not liking it. So we'll try to do the whole job this way. This is where, if human beings had developed a third hand, it would be most beneficial. Much better. Yeah, you can tell when they're seating in the way you want. And then you can kind of take a look We've got a magnifier, which I use to see, and that's seated in there very nicely. So, reverse the process. Bottom edge first. Top edge clips go in. Speaker wire. Final check. All looks and sounds good. Reverse the process on the microphones. The connectors only go one way. Try not to pull on the wires. If it helps, the way, it's a keyed connector, but if you can see the wires going into the connector, that's the correct orientation. Okay. Pay attention to the wire routing for these mic cables. Remember, we have some tabs on the back of the neck, so we're not going to push this on, we're going to hinge it on. But we're also not going to catch any of these wires back here. So this is where I kind of like to lift that loom up. Get that hinge in. Now I'm looking at this, I don't like that wire to be outside of the plastic post. I want it inside. The side looks good. Remember, we have to clear that little nose ridge. And this thing should go together easy. If it doesn't, something's probably in the way. The very last thing needs a little persuasion, which is the tip of the nose, but right now I'm kind of feeling my way through it. There. And you will get a little bit of gap until we put the screws in. But this is a good time. This is what I do. I go ahead and install just the screw at the top of the head, where the head sensor button is, thusly. Don't crank that thing down like crazy, just enough. And then make sure that the ear rotators are unobstructed, because what I will tell you is that they tend to bind. There's not a lot of power in them, and so if you don't get those in there right, or you screw that screw down too tightly, those guys will bind up. So if your ear isn't flicking once you've reassembled, either A, you forgot to reconnect it, B, you've damaged it, or C, there's just some tension binding it. I didn't say this at the onset of our videos, but this is one of my dogs that will be listed for sale. So, in case you were worried about this being your dog that you sent in for repair. Okay, and again, I'm going to check those rotators. They're moving really well. Okay, so last but not least, when you reinstall the spring, there's 3 plastic guides. Start from the front, let it lay to the back. Make sure you get all that. Then in the center of the head sensor button, there's a post that's going to go in the middle of that spring. I like to put the back in first. Make sure that post is lined up. And then snap. Make sure that works. Clean the visor, but for now we don't have to. Clean him up for a little while. Ears back on, center pins first. Clip the outers in. Center pins first, outers, and there's our pup. That's the rest of our pup. And then I'll go grab a battery and we'll see how he does. Okay, let's see if our hard work paid off. Good news is if it doesn't work like this, I get to fix it off camera. But let's try the usual thing. In truth, I don't know that I've ever run this dog since he came from Japan, but battery in and out a few times. Sounding better. Now there's no stick in this pup. We'll just see if he runs through his neck exercises. Pan looks good. Pitch looked good in the lifting of our head. Now I'm not sure if the tilt gets tested in the normal diagnostic. I should know that answer, but we'll boot him with a stick in a minute and see. Now there's tilt. Okay, so now we know. And that, friends, is a pitch, pan, and tilt access clutch replacement and cleaning. Hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll do our best to clean this up and make it presentable. Thanks for watching.